I gave my nephew my old car because he needed it, but his mom told the whole family I gifted it to control him. So I reported it stolen. The police showed up at their door on a Monday morning. The morning detective Nadia Ose called me to confirm the car had been recovered from my sister's driveway. I was sitting at my kitchen table eating cold scrambled eggs and feeling nothing. Not triumph, not grief. Just the strange, hollow quiet that follows a decision you spent months dreading and 30 seconds making. She told me my nephew Darius was present when officers arrived. She told me my sister Renata had screamed loud enough that a neighbor had filmed it on their phone. She told me the footage was already circulating in our family's group chat, the one I'd been removed from 6 weeks earlier, or right around the time Renata started calling me a manipulator to anyone who would listen. I put the phone down. I looked at my eggs. I thought about the version of myself that existed 2 years ago, the one who would have done anything for that family. And I tried to find some way to feel sorry for what I'd set in motion. I couldn't find it. Not even close. Let me back up, because if I start at the end, you'll think I'm the villain of the story. People always think the one who makes the call to the police is the villain. That's what Renata was counting on. She's always been good at controlling the narrative, framing things so that her choices look like reactions to other people's cruelty. She's been doing it since we were kids growing up in a small duplex in Columbus, Ohio, where being the louder, more dramatic sibling meant you got believed first. I was 2 years older than her, quieter, the kind of kid who did his homework at the kitchen table and stayed out of arguments because he'd learned early that arguments in our house didn't resolve anything, they just redistributed the pain. By the time we were adults, I thought we'd found a balance. She had her life, I had mine. And in the middle, like a thread connecting two very different worlds, was Darius. Darius was the kid who made everything feel worth it. I know that sounds like the kind of thing an uncle says, but I mean it in a specific, almost embarrassing way. He was sharp, genuinely, inconveniently sharp. The kind of kid who read things he didn't have to, who asked questions that made adults pause, who at 16 could break down a news article with more nuance than most people I knew at 30. He was also, by the time he turned 18, in a genuinely difficult situation. Renata and her husband Victor had been fighting for the better part of 2 years over money, over Victor's hours at work, over the way Renata spent what he brought home. The house was tense in the way that houses get when two people who still love each other have started to hate the life they built together. Darius had gotten into a state university 2 hours away, not Stanford, but a solid school with a solid engineering program. And the plan had always been for him to commute the first year to save money. Except Renata's car was unreliable, Victor's truck was his work vehicle, and Darius had passed his driver's test 8 months earlier and been driving on a learner's permit before that. He had no car. He had no way to get to school. And the bus route between their neighborhood and the campus was a 90-minute ordeal each way that required 2 transfers and a walk through a section of road that didn't have sidewalks. I had a car I wasn't using anymore, a 2016 Subaru Outback in decent shape. Some scratches on the rear bumper, a small crack in the dashboard from a summer I'd left a water bottle in the wrong spot, but mechanically solid. I'd bought a newer vehicle the previous spring, and the Outback had just been sitting in my driveway collecting leaves in a thin layer of Ohio pollen. I'd been meaning to sell it but kept putting it off. When I found out about Darius' situation, the decision felt obvious. Way so obvious that I didn't even call Renata first. I called Darius, told him to come over on a Saturday afternoon, and handed him the keys while we stood in my driveway eating sandwiches I'd made from whatever was left in my fridge. He stood there holding the key fob with this expression I've never quite been able to describe. Like something between gratitude and disbelief, the look of a person who wasn't used to things going right. I told him to drive safe. He hugged me, which he never did, and drove away in a perfectly functioning car that was mine to give. That should have been the whole story. A man gives a car to his nephew. The nephew goes to college. Everyone is fine. But here's the thing about doing something generous inside a family that runs on scarcity and competition. Someone always finds a way to make it ugly. And it took Renata exactly 11 days. The first sign something was wrong came from my mother, who called me on a Wednesday evening and opened with the words, "I'm not taking sides," which, in our family, has always meant she is firmly on one side and wants credit for being neutral. She told me Renata was upset. I asked why. There was a pause before my mother said carefully that Renata felt I should have consulted her before giving a car to her son. I told her I'd given the car to Darius, who was 18, who was an adult, who was capable of receiving a gift without his mother's permission. My mother said she understood that, and then added in a tone that suggested she didn't entirely understand it, that Renata also felt the car came with strings. I asked what strings. My mother got quiet again. She said Renata thought I was trying to make Darius feel like he owed me something, that I was making him beholden to me, that this was my way of inserting myself into his life and creating loyalty that bypassed his parents. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a long moment before I asked my mother if she actually believed any of that. She said she didn't know. Then she asked if maybe I could just apologize to Renata for not asking first. I said goodnight and hung up. A week later, the story had grown. I heard it from 3 different directions in the span of 48 hours. My cousin Phyllis texted me, asking if it was true I'd given the car to Darius as a way of undermining Victor's authority as a father. My uncle Raymond called to tell me Renata had spoken to him and that he thought I needed to think about my motives. And then, perhaps most surreally, Victor himself showed up at my door on a Thursday evening, looking uncomfortable in the way men look when they've been sent somewhere they didn't entirely choose to go. He stood on my porch and told me Renata had asked him to speak with me. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. I asked him what he actually thought about the car situation, and there was a long silence before he said quietly that he thought it was a generous thing I'd done. Then he told me Renata was telling people I had only given Darius the car to make them look bad as parents. I looked at Victor for a while. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that contains an entire marriage's worth of exhaustion. I told him I was sorry he was in the middle of this. He nodded and left. After that conversation, I poured myself a glass of water, sat on my couch, and thought very carefully about what was actually happening. What was happening was this. Renata had taken a simple act of generosity and was systematically reframing it as manipulation. She wasn't doing this because she believed it. She was doing it because it gave her a narrative. It made me the bad guy and her the protective mother. It explained why Darius might, in the future, feel closer to me than to her. Because I had been scheming all along, planting loyalty like seeds. The story also conveniently positioned any gratitude Darius felt toward me as evidence of corruption rather than human decency. It was elegant in a horrible way, and it was working. Where I could feel the family shifting around me, like water finding a new level, everyone recalibrating their opinion of me based on Renata's version of events. That's when I made a decision I should have made earlier. I called Gregory Holt. Gregory Holt had been my personal attorney for 4 years. He was a compact, methodical man in his early 50s who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses in every season and spoke in the kind of measured, unhurried sentences that made you feel like the room itself had slowed down. I'd originally hired him for a property dispute with a former landlord and kept him on retainer afterward because life had taught me that having a lawyer you trusted was worth the cost. I explained the situation to him over the phone. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, always he asked me one question. Was the car still in my name? I checked. It was. I had handed Darius the keys without ever completing the formal title transfer. In Ohio, a vehicle is legally owned by whoever's name appears on the title, and the title of the 2016 Subaru Outback still read Elliot James Pruitt. Gregory told me that legally, the car remained my property. He told me that made the situation considerably simpler than I might have thought. He said to sit tight for now, document everything, and call him if things escalated. They escalated. It was Darius's birthday dinner that broke things open completely. He turned 19 in early November and had invited a small group of people to a restaurant downtown. Some college friends, Victor and Renata, my mother and me. I arrived a few minutes late after getting stuck in traffic on the highway, and when I walked in, I immediately felt the atmosphere in the room. It had that particular quality of a space where something has just been said and everyone is now performing normal. Darius looked relieved when he saw me. Renata looked at her menu. I sat down next to my mother, and within about 4 minutes, she leaned over and murmured that Renata had apparently spent the time before I arrived, telling the college friends that I had a habit of buying people's affection. I'm not a person who loses composure easily. I've been told I have a face that doesn't show much when I'm angry, which is both an asset and something that apparently makes people think I don't feel things. I sat through that dinner for 90 minutes. I ordered food I didn't taste. I watched Renata perform warmth and motherhood for the room while managing, through careful word choices and meaningful pauses, to imply that I was a corrupting influence on her son. At one point, she said, with a bright smile directed at one of Darius's friends, "Elliot's always been the type who likes to feel needed." She laughed lightly after she said it. So did the friend. I drank my water and thought about what Gregory had told me. After dinner, I pulled Darius aside outside the restaurant while Renata was in the restroom. I asked him directly how things were going with the car. He looked immediately uncomfortable, which told me a lot. He said it was fine, the car was great, he'd been getting to campus without any problems. Then he hesitated and said his mom had been making comments. About what? I asked. As he rubbed the back of his neck, he said she'd been telling him the car was a transaction, that I was going to want something back eventually, that he should be careful about how close he got to me. I kept my voice very flat and asked if he believed that. He looked me in the eye and said no. He said he knew me well enough to know it wasn't true. Then he said, with the particular tiredness of a 19-year-old who has been triangulated for too long, I just don't know how to make her stop. I told him not to worry about making her stop. I told him to focus on school. I hugged him, walked to my car, and drove home in the dark, thinking about all the ways a person can be punished for being kind. Over the next 3 weeks, Renata escalated. She posted a vague message on her Facebook page about people who think gifts give them power. She called my Aunt Doreen, who then called my mother, who then called me. She texted Victor that she thought Darius should give the car back, that it was poisoning the family dynamic. Victor texted me privately to let me know because apparently he'd reached the limit of what he was willing to silently absorb. And then, on a Saturday morning in late November, I got removed from the family group chat. No explanation, no message. I just refreshed the app and found that I was no longer a participant. My cousin Phyllis texted me privately to say she was sorry, that she didn't agree with what Renata was doing, but that she also didn't want to get involved. That was the moment something inside me got very quiet and very decided. I called Gregory that afternoon. I told him about the escalation, the social media post, the campaign against my character, the attempt to pressure Darius into returning a car he legitimately needed. Gregory listened, then told me I had 2 options. I could attempt mediation, which he estimated had roughly a 20% chance of producing any useful outcome given what he'd heard about Renata's communication style. Or I could exercise my legal right as the registered owner of the vehicle. He didn't tell me what to do. He laid it out, professionally and without emotion, and asked what I wanted. I thought about Darius standing outside that restaurant, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought about Renata at the birthday dinner performing her gentle, smiling narrative. I thought about my mother saying she wasn't taking sides. I told Gregory what I wanted. The process was more procedural than dramatic, which somehow made it feel more serious. Gregory had me gather specific documentation first. The original title, proof of insurance still in my name, a dated photo of the vehicle on my property from before I handed over the keys, and screenshots of every text conversation in which Renata had made claims about the car. That last item turned out to be easier than I expected, because Renata had at some point shifted from talking about me to talking to me. She had sent me 17 text messages over the previous month, ranging in tone from wounded to accusatory to outright hostile. In one message, she referred to the car as your little power play. In another, she wrote, in all capital letters, You had no right to go around me. Gregory reviewed the screenshots and told me they were, in his words, quite useful. He prepared the relevant paperwork. I signed where I was told to sign. On a Sunday evening, I sent Darius a text. It was the hardest message I wrote through this entire ordeal, and I rewrote it 4 times before sending it. I told him I loved him and that what I was about to do had nothing to do with him and everything to do with drawing a line that should have been drawn earlier. I told him the car was being reported, that the police would likely come to the house, and that I needed him to understand this was not a punishment aimed at him. I told him that when things settled, I intended to complete the title transfer properly so the car was legally his, and that the only reason I hadn't done that yet was that Gregory had advised me to wait until the current situation resolved. I asked him to trust me. He texted back 40 minutes later. It was 2 words, I do. I held my phone for a long time after reading that. The report was filed Monday morning at 7:14 a.m. It went through the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. I provided the title, the VIN, and the address where the vehicle was currently located, which was Renata and Victor's driveway on the east side of Columbus. The officer who took my statement was a methodical, unhurried woman named Deputy Constance Ibarra, 12 years with the department, who asked me clear questions and wrote down my answers without editorializing. She asked if I had given anyone permission to operate the vehicle. I said I had loaned it informally, but had never transferred ownership and had not provided written or verbal permission for ongoing possession. She asked if there was documentation of my ownership. I handed her copies Gregory had prepared. She thanked me. She told me the responding unit would make contact with the individuals at the reported address. She also told me I should be aware that the situation might generate some friction with my family. I thanked her for the warning. What I heard about the Monday morning visit came from 3 sources, in this order: Victor, Darius, and eventually a neighbor named Octavia Reeves who had filmed part of it on her phone, and who I did not know personally, but who had, apparently, Oh, I've been following the family drama at a distance with the particular interest that neighbors develop when there is ongoing tension visible through adjacent windows and thin walls. Victor called me at 9:53 that morning. He was outside on the street, speaking quietly, and I could hear traffic behind him. He said 2 officers had knocked on the door at approximately 8:40 a.m. He said Renata had answered and that things had gone sideways very quickly. He said Renata had initially refused to believe the car was being reported stolen, had told the officers there must be some mistake, had asked to call someone without specifying who. One of the officers had asked for the keys and the title. Renata did not have a title. She had produced the keys, and then, when she understood from the officer's expression that this was not a misunderstanding, had begun shouting. Victor described the shouting as significant. He said the word significant twice. The officers had taken the vehicle. Renata was threatening to call a lawyer. Darius had watched the whole thing from the front step without saying a word. Detective Osei's involvement came later in the day. She was not assigned to the initial report, but had been flagged by the deputy who took my statement because there were, apparently, elements of the situation that warranted a follow-up conversation. Nadia Osei had 19 years with the sheriff's office, 14 of them in civil and domestic matters. She was calm, precise, and had the particular quality of experienced investigators who make you feel like they already know a version of the story and are simply checking their version against yours. She met me at a coffee shop near my office at 2 p.m. She had reviewed the documentation Gregory had submitted. She had also, she told me, reviewed the screenshots of Renata's text messages, which had been included in the filing. She wanted to clarify one thing. Had I, at any point, indicated to the recipient of the vehicle that it was a permanent gift? I told her I had said the words, "This is yours," when I handed over the keys. She wrote something down. She told me that phrase could complicate a theft charge slightly, but that since the title had never transferred and my ownership documentation was unambiguous, the core legal question of who owned the vehicle was not in dispute. She said it was unlikely to result in criminal charges against my sister, given the informal nature of the original handover, but that recovering the vehicle had been within my legal rights. She also said, with the specific neutrality of someone who has learned to keep their opinions off the record, that the text message where Renata wrote, "You had no right to go around me," in reference to giving a car to an adult was, quote, "interesting." I agreed that it was interesting. Gregory called me that evening. He'd been in contact with Renata's attorney. She had, in fact, called a lawyer, a general practice attorney named Floyd Essen, who Gregory knew tangentially through the local bar association. Floyd had called to inquire about my intentions regarding the vehicle and whether I was pursuing further legal action. Gregory told him I was not pursuing criminal charges, that I had exercised my right as registered owner, and that I remained open to completing the title transfer directly to Darius, bypassing Renata entirely, provided she ceased her campaign against my character and acknowledged, in writing, that the gift was unconditional. Floyd had apparently gone quiet on the phone for a moment before saying he'd relay the offer. Gregory told me to be patient. Patience has never been my strong suit, but I'd already made the hard choice, so patience felt manageable by comparison. What came next was 2 weeks of the most surreal family communications I have ever experienced. Renata, apparently furious that her lawyer had communicated a settlement possibility without consulting her fully, went back on Facebook. The post she wrote was longer this time, more detailed, aber full of phrases like financial manipulation and family loyalty used as currency, and some people can't stand watching others build something real. She didn't name me. She didn't have to. Everyone in our family knew who she was talking about. Phyllis texted me again saying she was so sorry. My Aunt Doreen called and actually, for the first time, expressed that she thought Renata was out of line. My mother called and cried a little, which I wasn't expecting, and said she should have said something sooner and that she was sorry. I told her it was okay, because it was, mostly. People get frightened of confrontation, especially in families where drama has always had a cost. I understood it, even when it hurt. Victor, meanwhile, had entered a new phase of honesty. He came to my office on a Wednesday afternoon unannounced and sat across from me in the chair I kept for clients and said, without preamble, that he and Renata were separating. He'd spoken to a family law attorney that morning. He didn't say it directly, but I understood from the way he talked about it, the specific months he mentioned, the things he referenced, that Renata's behavior over the car had been the final crystallizing moment of something that had been dissolving for a long time. He thanked me, which surprised me. I asked what for. He said for not backing down. He said Renata had spent years operating on the assumption that being loud enough and long enough made you right, and that watching someone simply refuse to absorb that had been, in his words, something he needed to see. I didn't know what to say to that. I offered him coffee. He accepted. We sat there for 40 minutes, not talking about the legal situation at all, and it was the best conversation I'd had in weeks. Darius came to my apartment on a Thursday evening about 10 days after the car had been recovered. He'd taken the bus, which took an hour and 20 minutes, and he arrived at my door looking rumpled and serious. I made dinner, pasta, nothing elaborate, and we sat at my kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. He told me things about the last year inside his parents' house that I hadn't fully known, the arguments that went past midnight, the way his mother would sometimes spend entire weekends reprocessing a grievance until everyone in the house was exhausted by proximity to her anger, the subtle ways she'd been working on him about the car since the moment he drove it home. And he told me that shortly after I'd given him the car, Renata had sat him down and told him that my generosity was a loan in disguise, that I would eventually use it to pressure him toward things she didn't want, spending time with me over her, following my advice over hers, building a life that didn't have her at the center. He told me he'd never fully believed it, but that hearing it repeated enough times had started to create a kind of static, a doubt that hovered around every interaction we had. He said that when I texted him the Sunday night before the car was reported, the thing that had finally cut through the static was that I told him what I was doing and why before I did it. He said his mother had never once in his memory done that. She announced, she enacted, she explained afterward, if at all. Guess the fact that I'd warned him, that I'd respected him enough to tell him the truth before it happened, had been the thing that made him text back those 2 words. I'm going to sit with that for the rest of my life. The simple fact that telling a 19-year-old the truth about what you're about to do can be the thing that breaks through 2 months of poisoning. It's humbling and infuriating in equal measure. Renata had worked hard to make me look like someone who operated through concealment, through strategy, through gifts as control. And the thing that exposed that entire narrative as false was me doing the one thing she never did, telling the truth before I had to. The written acknowledgement Renata had been asked to provide through the attorneys never came in exactly the form Gregory had specified. In what did come, about 3 weeks after the car was recovered, was a brief email from Floyd Essen indicating that his client did not dispute the unconditional nature of the original gift and was not pursuing any further legal claims regarding the vehicle. It was, technically and lawyerly, a form of acknowledgement. Gregory told me it was sufficient. I authorized the title transfer. The paperwork was completed within the week, and Darius became the legal owner of a 2016 Subaru Outback on a cold Friday afternoon in December, when he sat in my kitchen and signed documents while I made hot chocolate and thought about how much had happened since I'd handed him those keys in my driveway over a sandwich. He asked me if I regretted any of it. I thought about it honestly before answering. I told him I regretted that it had taken so long to understand what was happening. I regretted not drawing the line earlier, not recognizing sooner how thoroughly Renata had learned to turn generosity into a story about power. I regretted the birthday dinner and the family group chat and my mother crying on the phone. But the action itself, no. I did not regret reporting the car. Not because it was satisfying, though I'd be dishonest if I said there wasn't a cold, clean feeling in having done it, but because the alternative was absorbing Renata's version of events indefinitely, watching it harden into the accepted family truth, and spending the rest of my relationship with Darius under the shadow of her narrative. I wasn't willing to do that, not for her comfort, not to keep a peace that was only peaceful on the surface. A Renata and Victor's separation became official by February. Victor found an apartment. He texted me occasionally, nothing heavy, just the ordinary check-ins of 2 people who have been through something adjacent and come out with an unexpected respect for each other. Darius finished his first year of college with a 3.4 GPA, which I only know because he texted me a photo of his transcript with a caption that said, "The car works great, by the way." I laughed for the first time in a long time at that. Genuinely, fully laughed. My mother and I had a longer conversation in March that I won't fully reconstruct here, but the short version is that she acknowledged she'd allowed Renata to lead her for decades by being louder and more insistent, and that she was old enough now to admit that this was a pattern she'd let shape too many of her own responses. She didn't quite apologize for the Thanksgiving call, but she circled it several times with enough honesty that I understood her. My mother is not a villain. She's a woman who raised 2 very different children in difficult circumstances and got worn down by the one who pushed harder. That's a human failure, not a moral one. I told her I loved her, and I meant it. Renata texted me once in late February from a number I didn't immediately recognize. The message read, "I know you think you won something. You didn't." I looked at it for a while. Then I typed back, "I got Darius to school safely. That's all I was trying to do." She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to. What I learned from this, and I mean specifically, he practically in the material sense of the word, is that documentation is not cynicism. When Gregory asked me for those screenshots, I was glad I'd kept them. When Deputy Ibarra asked for proof of ownership, I was glad I'd never completed that transfer out of pure laziness. The paper trail that saved me wasn't something I'd assembled strategically. It was just the residue of ordinary life. But I'll be more intentional going forward. Not paranoid. Just clear-eyed about the fact that good faith on your part does not guarantee good faith on the other person's, and that love without documentation is, sometimes, just a story someone else gets to tell. The car sits in a parking lot at Darius's college most weekdays now. He told me he parks it near the engineering building because it's closest to his first lecture. He's studying material science, which I had to look up when he first told me. It involves understanding how physical materials behave under stress, how things hold together or break apart under pressure. I told him that sounded like something he'd been studying his whole life without a textbook. He told me that was a terrible joke. I told him I know. We've talked on the phone most Sunday evenings since December. It's easy, the way things are easy when the static has finally been cleared. I'm not interested in a reunion with Renata. I want to be straightforward about that. There are people in your life whose harm is accidental, born from their own wounds, and those relationships are worth the effort of repair. And then there are people who are deliberate, who take the clean thing you offered and choose to make it ugly because the ugly version serves them better. Renata knew what the car was. She knew what I meant when I gave it. She chose a different story because that story gave her leverage. That's not something you fix over a conversation. That's a pattern, and patterns either change through years of genuine work or they don't change at all. She's shown me her pattern clearly enough that I'm not inclined to keep testing the theory. I don't think I'm special for what I did. I gave a car to a kid who needed one. I refused to let that be twisted into something it wasn't. I used the legal tools available to me when everything else had failed. These are not heroic acts. They're just what you do when you decide that your own character is worth defending, even when the defense costs something. The cost in this case was a fractured family holiday season, a mother who cried on the phone, a brother-in-law I never expected to respect as much as I do now, and a nephew who sends me photos of his transcript. I'd make that trade again without blinking. Detective Osei closed the case with no charges filed. Gregory submitted his final invoice in January. Deputy Ibarra never followed up, which meant the situation had resolved cleanly enough that it didn't warrant further attention. The Subaru Outback has new plates now, registered properly to Darius Elliott Pruitt. Yes, his middle name is mine. A detail Renata had apparently always resented, and which I had somehow forgotten until Darius mentioned it during one of our Sunday calls. He said his mom had been wanting to change it since he was 12. He said he never let her. He said it like it was just a small fact, a footnote. I held the phone very still and didn't say anything for a moment. Then I told him to drive safe. He said he always does.